Hello and welcome back to Bookish. I was not going to make a video about critical race theory, despite the fact that Fox News and other right-wing news outlets are saturating their airwaves with this discussion about the boogie-boo of critical race theory. I didn't take it seriously, and that is until recently, when states like Florida and Arizona and Texas began to try to legislate against the teaching of critical race theory in public schools. No one teaches critical race theory in public schools like high schools, etc. As a matter of fact, unless you're a history major probably in college, you're not even coming close to being taught what critical race theory is. That's just not happening. But legislatures are trying to outlaw it and trying to find teachers and trying to prevent critical race theory from being taught. Even that wasn't going to push me into making this video, but a couple of days ago, or maybe a day before yesterday, I got a comment on an old video I'd made about a William Faulkner work from somebody I hadn't heard from before who was kind of questioning one of the conclusions I made, and I engaged that person in the comment section. In the course of those comments, I came to realize that this person was a Confederate apologist, and when I went to their YouTube page, sure enough, most of their videos are all about how the Confederacy was misunderstood and how the Civil War wasn't about slavery and how great Robert E. Lee really was. And so I realized who I was dealing with. Yesterday he put out a video about critical race theory. There's nothing particularly original in his video. He essentially just parrots back the exact same thing that you can find on Fox News when they talk about critical race theory. But that kind of pushed me over the edge. I thought, well, this guy can go out there and make a video trying to scare everybody about critical race theory. I can make a video and use my platform, do whatever good it can do to try to expose what's really at the heart of this hysteria about critical race theory. So to begin with, let me tell you what critical race theory is. Critical race theory is a theory developed in American universities, in history departments and African American studies departments and others, which suggests that one way to understand American history is to understand the history of oppression by the white majority, which still today controls government, the history of the white majority using that government power to oppress African Americans. It suggests that racism goes beyond just individual bias and prejudice, that real racism is what we now think of as institutionalized racism. That real racism, and the racism that really drives and factors into the history of the United States, is the racism reflected in our laws and in policies passed and created by the United States government. That's what critical race theory says. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, you know, that's obviously true, then you see the problem that the critics of critical race theory have and why they never actually address that issue. When the critics of critical race theory start talking about it, they're trying to scare conservative American voters into thinking that critical race theory is a threat to the values and traditions of the United States of America. It is not, unless you consider racism and institutionalized racism a part of the values of the United States of America. But they don't address the issue directly. Instead, they say things like, they make a big deal about how critical race theory is really a communist theory, and here's how that goes. They say, okay, critical race theory is based on critical theory, and critical theory, I think, in all likelihood, I believe, as far as I know, was developed by Marxist historians in the 1920s and 30s who looked at history pretty much in a Marxist way, saying that history can be understood as a contest between the oppressors and the oppressed, that everything in history can be looked at that way. And so since critical race theory uses that same kind of, setup only in terms of race and here in the United States, then they say, well, critical race theory is actually communist. This is ridiculous on all kinds of levels, and it also kind of overlooks something really important. I can be against communism, state communism, a communism that takes over a government and enforces communist policies because it's totalitarian. I can be against that and still acknowledge that Marx and others were right when they said that workers, serfs, farmers were being exploited and oppressed by people with power and money during the Industrial Revolution or during in the Russian Empire phase. That's an obvious truth. That is an obvious truth. Whether it came from communists or not, it's still true. And critical race theory is true in the exact same way. It doesn't matter if communist historians set up the model. If what the model proves is true, that's what matters. If we follow critical race theory, we're not all of a sudden going to become communists. I mean, how ridiculous is that? How long in the United States of America have conservatives been trying to scare us with the idea of a communist takeover? And this one's going to come from teaching critical race theory? Or come from teaching the actual racist history of the United States? So that's just ridiculous. In addition to that, critics of critical race theory will say, oh, well, critical race theory says all white people are racist. No, critical race theory does not say that. Critical race theory says the policies created by the United States government and the laws we enforce, historically and through today, oftentimes work to oppress African Americans. That's what it actually says. It doesn't say that every white person's racist, but what it does point out, and this is important, what it does point out is that if you are a person of any race who supports politicians who promote policies and create laws which oppress African Americans, then you are in fact part of the problem, whether you're individually racist or not. You don't have to be a racist to be playing a part in supporting and continuing and creating institutionalized racism. You can do that simply by how you vote, and guess why the critical race theory people want you to be afraid of critical race theory? So you'll keep voting for those politicians who are going to keep creating laws and rules and regulations and policies that oppress and discriminate against and seek to control African Americans. How do I know this is true? Because this is the story of American history. From 1619 to 1865, slavery in the United States was legal. It was codified in the United States Constitution and in thousands of state laws and court decisions, from the colonial period through the end of the Civil War, when slavery came to an end. Slavery came to an end, chattel slavery in the sense of hereditary race-based slavery came to an end. And slavery was a system of laws and policies enacted by the white majority who controlled the United States government to oppress the African American people. This is part of the historical basis for critical race theory. That exact thing. Forgive me for sweating. I was working in the front yard trying to dig a stump out of the ground. Okay? That's exactly what it says. And when slavery came to an end, did conservative and white Southerners say, okay, well, that's it. No more racial oppression? No. They didn't. They created Jim Crow America. They created segregation. They created and passed laws and enforced policies. Remember, critical race theory says that the important part of racism is that the majority uses laws and policies to oppress the African Americans. They passed laws to do exactly that denied African Americans the right to vote, that denied them full rights of citizenship, that denied them the right to a trial by jury, that denied them their rights. And that lasted from, let's say, the end of Reconstruction in 1877 till the Fair Housing Act in 1968. That lasted almost another 100 years. So critical race theory then is right to portray American history in that light, because that is a true and accurate part of American history. The white majority used its control of government to enact laws and to create policies which worked to the detriment, discriminated against, oppressed, controlled African Americans. You cannot deny that that's true. So if we say that ended in 1968, which it obviously didn't, but if we say that ended in 1968, then what the critics of critical race theory want you to believe is that, conservatives and white Southerners threw up their hands and said, okay, that's it, I guess we have to accept equality, but of course they didn't. Then they turned their lawmaking, their policy making in a different direction. They turned it towards what they referred to as the war on crime, where they specifically targeted African Americans. They made laws which worked to the detriment of African Americans. Mandatory sentencing, 3 strikes and you're in. Tougher or harsher sentences for people who are caught in possession of crack cocaine than for people who are caught in possession of powdered cocaine. Guess what? In the 80s and 90s, African Americans were more likely to be in possession of crack cocaine, and white Americans were more likely to be in possession of powdered cocaine. And even though the white people in possession of powdered cocaine might have as much or more than the African American possession of crack cocaine, the African American possession of crack cocaine still went to prison for longer. The war on drugs targeted African Americans disproportionately. I mean, just think about it. The African American percentage of the population is only 13% of the population of the United States of America. They are not the only people. They were not the only people selling drugs, dealing drugs, importing drugs, using drugs. As a matter of fact, the vast majority of drug users and dealers were in fact white, but you wouldn't know that from looking at the prison population, because those laws were created specifically to target African Americans, because this is another version of control and oppression. A white majority in control the government used to control and oppress African Americans. The effort to limit African American voting that resulted in the Supreme Court case of Shelby County versus Holder, which gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. As soon as that was passed, conservative state governments and southern state governments began to do things that limited African Americans' right or ability to vote. One of the most egregious things they did is they began to shut down voting locations, polling places in predominantly African American neighborhoods, so that a whole African American precinct might only have one, or a whole African American area might only have one polling place for tens of thousands of people, where in a predominantly white suburban neighborhood like I live, there were 3 or 4 places where I could go to vote early. They keep the voting times, it's only open from 7 to 5. Guess when most people who work hourly wages work? 7 to 5. And since, because of past discrimination and present discrimination, African Americans are more likely to work hourly wage jobs, and therefore you cut off their access to vote. So what you get then in African American neighborhoods are incredibly long lines where people wait for 4, 5, 6 hours to vote, which definitely discourages voting. Voter ID laws. Well, voter ID laws sound like a good idea, and conservatives have worked hard to convince us that there's all this voter fraud, which there isn't, and therefore we need photo IDs. But the states decide which photo IDs count, and guess which photo IDs they accept the most? They accept the ones white people are most likely to have, driver's license and passports, and the ones African Americans are less likely to have. That's not accidental. In addition to that, you may be saying, well, African Americans can go get one of those state ID cards. You don't have to be a driver's license. You're right, but guess what? States then begin shutting down offices in African American neighborhoods where you could get those state ID cards and moving them further away, again discouraging African Americans from voting. These are laws and policies that have been enacted in recent memory, and guess what conservatives in control of southern and other state governments are trying to do right now? They're trying to pass even more of those restrictions. They've criminalized handing out water to people waiting in line to vote. People wouldn't have to wait in line to vote so long. They were in danger of dehydration if the states hadn't reduced polling places in African American and other minority neighborhoods. So are those laws, voter ID laws, Shelby County versus Holder, policies making it illegal to hand out water, policies requiring voter IDs while simultaneously making it harder for African Americans to get voter IDs, are those examples of the white majority who still controls the governments of the United States, using their power to create laws and policies which oppress and control African Americans? Of course they are. The reason why critical race theory has come up and is such a big deal right now, and why critics of critical race theory are talking about it so much right now, is they are trying to cover for voter suppression taking place at the state level. They're trying to scare conservative voters into believing that if they don't come out against critical race theory and they don't support conservative politicians who are enacting these voter restriction laws, then the United States is going to collapse and fall in on itself. Additionally, critics of critical race theory will say that critical race theory absolves African Americans of all individual responsibility. It most certainly does not. They will say that critical race theory is trying to teach people to hate America by pointing out all the flaws and racism in our past. It most certainly is not. If teaching people the truth is teaching them to hate, your country has problems. And your policy, your point of view has problems. So critical race theory critics focus on everything but what critical race theory says, because what critical race theory says, as I saw a tweet just today, is just common sense. We know from our history, and we know from present day America, that the white majority that controls governments oftentimes in the past has absolutely used its power to make laws and policies to oppress and control African Americans, slavery, Jim Crow, and we know that that's going on right now. So why so what critics want is for conservatives to be afraid. You should know right now that almost everything about this controversy about critical race theory is designed to scare white people into believing bad things are going to happen. That the United States is going to collapse, that they're going to be the targets of racial war. By the way, the whole idea that the Black Lives Matter movement is the one promoting racial violence is obviously ridiculous, but they use that to scare white people, just like slave owners used to scare white people with rumors and talks of slave rebellions. It's no different. These people are operating from the exact same playbook. So in watching that guy's video, who had commented on one of my videos and attempted to comment on his channel, which he deleted because he didn't like them. And that's fine, that's his channel, it's his business. In watching his videos and noticing he talked about critical race theory, and that most of what he talks about is the Confederacy and how great it was, and how misunderstood the South and the Confederacy were. In looking at his channel and thinking about that, I realized something important. People like this guy who made the video, politicians who are attacking the conservative race theory, the people who listen to them and are afraid that conservative racism is a threat to the United States of America are actually afraid that they're going to lose control. And they are obsessed with the Confederacy. Statues, the flag, Robert E. Lee's reputation. By the way, Robert E. Lee committed treason, therefore he's a traitor. Why his name should be on anything is a mystery to me. We don't have, we don't have Benedict Arnold University anywhere. We don't have high schools named after Benedict Arnold, but we do after Lee. Both of them were treasonous. Anyway, why is there this connection then between these kind of paranoid critics of critical race theory and love of the Confederacy? It's because in the minds of these people, the Confederacy was a white man's utopia. It was a government set up, and this is documented in the secession documents. It was a white supremacist government set up to keep white men in control, to keep African Americans enslaved and under control, to deprive them of their rights, to make a government where white men didn't have to listen to women and wealthy white men could remain in power by depriving economic opportunities to everybody. These white conservative critics of critical race theory and these reactionary politicians we see today, like the ones who attacked the United States Capitol in an attempt to overthrow, to create a coup and overthrow the results of an election, these people idealize the Confederacy because to them that is the utopian America, an America in which white men reign supreme. And white men today and white people from this group today are so afraid of losing the control they have left, they are more than willing to destroy the United States government, the Constitution, and our democracy to hold on to power. Just like the secessionists, the Confederate leaders they idealize, were willing to destroy the United States to hold on to power. Look forward to your comments in the comment section below. As always, thank you for watching.